So I guess we should start with the question, when the writer of Hebrews says he makes the first one obsolete, and what is becoming obsolete and growing old is ready to vanish away, is he referring to the scriptures that we call the Old Testament, or rather specifically to the Mosaic covenant? If all we had to read from Hebrews was chapter 8, verse 13, we might come away thinking that all of the Old Testament is irrelevant to the church, that it is, in fact, vanishing away. But reading the rest of Hebrews, and indeed all of the New Testament, puts this idea to rest. Hebrews and the rest of the New Testament are absolutely replete with citations, quotations, references, and all of those to the books of the Old Testament. In fact, with one exception in 2 Peter 3:16, referring to Paul's writings, anytime the word Scripture is used in the New Testament, it is referring to what we call the Old Testament. Remember that, for the writers of the New Testament, there wasn't yet a New Testament to cite. It would be a strange way of suggesting that the writings of the Old Testament are irrelevant to Christians by citing them so often. No, we can see from the writings of the New Testament, as well as how the earliest Christians used the word Scripture, that the writings of the Old Testament were, and therefore are, considered authoritative, canonical for the Church of Christ. Far from seeing them as irrelevant, the early Christians made their case for Jesus being the fulfillment of God's plan from the Old Testament, rather than suggesting that Christians should avoid or discard it. So what then do we do with the Old Testament as Christians? Well, first and foremost, remember what we said in our last discussion is the overarching theme of the whole story of the Bible. The record of God's faithfulness to human beings and his plan to reconcile them to himself for all eternity. Is the Old Testament a part of that story? Absolutely. In fact, it's foundational. Without the Old Testament, there is no New Testament. The Old Testament reveals the character and nature of the God who created, the God who is, and in his very essence, being itself. It reveals a God who lovingly pursues his creation, especially the pinnacle of his creation, human beings, and refuses to abandon them to their own destruction. And it reveals God's plan to do something about that terrible introduction of sin into his good creation, ultimately providing prophetic expectation of the coming of Jesus Christ. Indeed, the early church saw behind every word, maybe every letter, a foreshadowing of Jesus and his rescuing action. They read the Old Testament Christocentrically, looking for allusions and references to the ultimate fulfillment of God's plan in Jesus. In reading the Old Testament, we encounter Christ.
If you like what you've heard and you want more, visit christian-studies.org and subscribe to the video course on understanding the Bible. And while you're there, check out our journal and other content from the Center for Christian Studies.